On the night Zimbabwe became a free country, Robert Mugabe stood before his people and called for peace. He told white Zimbabweans they had nothing to fear, that the war was over, that it was time to build something together. The crowd was enormous, the moment was electric, and the world watched and thought, here is the man Africa has been waiting for. He was celebrated. He was admired. He was put forward for the Nobel Peace Prize. By the time he died, that same man had overseen the massacre of tens of thousands of his own people. He destroyed one of Africa's strongest economies and ruled through fear and violence for 37 years. This is the story of how that happened, not the headlines, the actual journey. Because the distance between those two moments is not the story of a good man turning evil. It is something far more complicated than that, and far more human. Part 1. The story. Robert Mugabe was born in 1924 in a small village in what was then southern Rhodesia. His father left when he was young. His mother raised him strictly, with a deep Catholic faith and an obsession with education. He earned 7 university degrees, 3 of them while he was in prison. That is not a man who lacks discipline. That is a man driven by something deep. He trained as a teacher, spent time in Ghana in the late 1950s, and came home wanting liberation. In 1964, the Rhodesian government locked him up for 10 years. While inside, his first son died. The government refused to let him attend the funeral. He was not allowed to say goodbye to his own child. Whatever Robert Mugabe was, when he went into that prison, he was not the same person when he came out. When he was released in 1974, he took command of ZANU in Mozambique. The liberation war was brutal. By 1980, Mugabe's party won a landslide victory. He stood up on Independence Night and gave a speech about reconciliation. In the early years, Zimbabwe's economy was strong. Literacy rates climbed. Healthcare improved. The world held him up as a model. And then, very quietly at first, the other things started. In 1983, a military unit called the 5th Brigade moved into Matabiland. What they did there has a name, Gukarandi. The 5th Brigade conducted a massacre. Villages surrounded. Men shot, women raped, mass graves. Estimates of the death toll range from 20,000 to 80,000 people. The world largely looked away. Through the 80s and 90s, he methodically dismantled every check on his own power. It was in 2000 that everything collapsed. After losing a referendum, gangs backed by the government began seizing white-toned farms. He called it justice, but it was chaos. A country that had fed the continent could no longer feed itself. By 2008, Zimbabwe saw the worst hyperinflation ever recorded. A $100 trillion note could not buy a loaf of bread. He held on through rigged elections and violence until November 2017, when tanks surrounded parliament. He resigned after 37 years. He died in 2019 at 95. Zimbabwe gave him a state funeral. Some people wept. Some people did not. Now we step back, because the question this story leaves us with is not simply what Robert Mugabe did. It is why, and what his story tells us about something that goes far beyond one man in one country. Because Robert Mugabe did not start as a monster, and that is exactly what makes him worth studying. There is a phrase most people have heard. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Most people treat it as a warning about villains. But it is not really about villains. It is about something more specific. Power changes the information you receive. When you have no power, people tell you the truth because there is nothing to gain from flattering you. When you have total power, almost everyone around you has something to gain from telling you what you want to hear. The feedback loop that keeps most of us connected to reality starts to break down. You stop being corrected, stop being challenged. And slowly, without realizing it, your understanding of reality drifts further and further from what is actually true. By the time Mugabe was ordering the Gukarandi massacres, he was surrounded by people whose careers depended on agreeing with him. By the time he was destroying the economy with the land seizures, his inner circle was telling him it was working. The people who might have told him the truth were in prison, in exile, or dead. This is not an excuse, it is an explanation. Mugabe had real grievances. not imagined ones, real ones. He grew up in a country where he was treated as less than human. He watched his people dispossessed and humiliated. He was imprisoned for a decade. His child died and he was not allowed to say goodbye. These are not small wounds. These are the kinds that do not fully heal. And here is where human psychology becomes genuinely complicated. Because a real grievance, a historically accurate one, can become the justification for anything. Once you have established in your own mind that you are the wronged party, that history is on your side, that justice is your cause, it becomes possible to absorb almost any action you take into that framework. The massacre of the Ndebele becomes crushing enemies of the revolution. The destruction of the economy becomes reclaiming what was stolen. Every atrocity gets quietly filed under the category of fighting back. Psychologists call this moral licensing. The idea that having suffered something unjust or having done something genuinely good gives you a kind of credit that you can then spend on behavior you would otherwise recognize as wrong. Mugabe had enormous amounts of this credit. He had genuinely suffered. He had genuinely fought for something just, and he spent that credit. Then there's the question of why people followed him for so long. Part of the answer is simple and brutal: fear. When the alternative to supporting a leader is having your home burned or being taken away in the night, most people support the leader. That is not weakness. That is survival. But there is something else. Mugabe gave people a story, and human beings need stories. We need a way of making sense of our situation that tells us who the heroes are and who the villains are and where we fit. His story was powerful precisely because it was built on something true. Colonialism was real. The land grievance was real. When a leader takes a true grievance and builds a story around it that explains everything, it is remarkably hard to step outside it. This pattern is not unique to Zimbabwe, liberation movement that becomes the thing it fought against. The faces change. Story stays the same. Robert Mugabe had spent his entire adult life as the liberator. That was not just his political identity. It was who he was. And once your identity is built on a story like that, the thing you cannot afford to do is look honestly at the evidence. If Mugabe admits that his land reforms destroyed his country, he is dismantling the entire framework through which he understands himself, so he could not admit it. To say it would mean becoming, in his own eyes, not the liberator, but the man who ruined it. This is what happens when identity and power fuse together over decades. A person stops being able to distinguish between themselves and the country. Robert Mugabe was not born a dictator. He was a man of intelligence and courage who fought a real injustice and won. Then used that victory to build something that eventually became indistinguishable from what he had fought against. The lesson is about what happens when there are no functioning constraints. No independent courts, no free press, no genuine opposition. We build institutions to protect us from exactly this. From the human tendency to believe our own story more deeply the longer we tell it. He called himself a liberator until the day he died. And in 1980, on Independence Night, with the crowd cheering, what happened in between, is the question history keeps asking. Not just about him, about all of us. Thanks for watching. Stay curious.